Hey, everybody. We've moved out of the story that is symbolized by the Maseroth-Stein Virgo. We spent several weeks going through the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their roles in the Abrahamic covenant. And it's important to remember that God initially spoke the land and the people promises to Abraham, but then he reiterated those promises to both Abraham and Jacob personally, saying that the promises would actually flow through them. And now, as we work our way into Libra, the story of Jacob actually continues. And I mentioned before that a lot of these stories, a lot of these characters kind of flow from one sign or one story to the next. Jacob is now called Israel, which means strong or mighty with God. And in our last lesson, we talked about how the older Jacob returning to Canaan with his two wives, Leah and Rachel, as well as his two concubines or his other wives, and a total of 11 sons, he meets with his twin brother Esau, whom he hadn't seen for a couple of decades, and unexpectedly was met with open arms. He wasn't really sure how his return home was going to be met. We're told in Genesis chapter 33 that Jacob moves on and settles in Shechem. And this is after he meets up with Esau. And we see Shechem, I believe I mentioned this in one of our earlier lessons, that we see Shechem called Sychar later in the New Testament, which is where Jesus met the woman, the Samaritan woman at the well. But we also saw Shechem earlier in Genesis, because this was the first place that God appeared to Abraham, or I should say Abram technically, right after he left Haran and went to Canaan. And one of the things that has struck me as I have gone through these stories in quite a bit of detail is that the places where important events happened, whether it was in Abraham's story or Isaac's or Jacob's, these places seem to have biblical significance. And it's not just that they showed up one time, but things happened here or in these different places over and over again. For example, Shechem or Sychar showing up in several different places. So we're moving on now to the sign of Libra. And the sign of Libra is basically it's about the law. That's the classic symbol for Libra, their scales of justice, in which justice is supposed to be blind, impartial, equal, playing no favorites. As I've gone through these lessons, I've tried to point out along the way where critics of the Bible and critics of the Christian faith take issue with things that they see in the Bible, and I think justice or a lack of justice is one of them. For example, it's not uncommon for them to claim that God is unjust in having destroyed the world in the flood, or, on many occasions we see in the Bible the Jews being used to kill entire tribes or entire cities of people. But I pointed out last week that God told Abraham that at least one of the reasons for the 400 years of affliction that he foretold was to give the Amorite people time to repent. He said, you'll come out of Egypt. In essence, he was saying you won't go into the promised land until the time of the Amorites is complete. So he gave them plenty of time to repent or to prove themselves completely wicked and deserving of judgment. And while I'm on the topic of justice and judgment, God doesn't play favorites, even with his own people. We'll see later under the sign of Aquarius that God used King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians to judge the unfaithful Jews. He used Titus in the New Testament era to destroy the temple in AD 70. And these are just a few examples of how God has dealt harshly but justly with his own people. God set the expectation of acting justly or righteously very early on. In Genesis 17, we read how God appeared to Abraham and he said, "I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless." And he was talking about walking and acting in accord with God's laws. And, of course, Abraham was not the only one to whom God gave a system of laws and rules. He gave rules to Adam and Eve, to Cain and Abel, the righteous line of Seth and Enosh, Noah and Shem on the post-flood side of things. But one of the big concepts to key in on now as we get into this discussion of Libra and eventually the law of Moses is that He's transitioning now as we go from Virgo into Libra. He's transitioning from dealing primarily with three individuals, being Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to now preparing to train a nation, right? Remember, part of the people promise was that he was going to make Abraham a great nation. Well, he has to go from training these individuals to training the entire nation itself. So step one of God fulfilling the prophecy that we read about back in the introduction in Genesis 3:15, which would eventually bring about the Messiah and his defeat of the serpent. Step one of making that happen was electing or choosing Abraham and making a promise and delivering an oath to fulfill that promise. But then he had to reiterate that to Isaac and then to Jacob, as we just mentioned. Step two of God's fulfillment then was to act on the people part of the Abrahamic covenant. He had to make Abraham a great nation, and that was going to begin in the cauldron, if you will, or the crucible that was Egypt. During Abraham's life, he was made a great tribe, but he was never a great nation, and neither was Isaac, neither was Jacob. That would happen after their lifetime, actually. So God was, what we see him doing is we see him moving events and stirring the hearts of people to bring these proto-Israelites or these pre-Israelites into Egypt, and of course teaching them very valuable lessons along the way and using the stories of these individuals to teach the nation and eventually the world. Now, as we are going through this entire study, what we've committed to doing is talking about the stories that are represented by these different star signs. And, unfortunately, sometimes the amount of time that we're given to do that doesn't match the scope and the breadth of the story we have to tell. So, for example, this time of year, the sun rises in Libra only. There's only 3 weekends that's within that period of time. It's a little bit more than 3 weeks, but 3 weekends to cover the entire story of Moses and the law. So what I want to do in this first part of lesson 8 is that I want to talk about some of the stories of justice and injustice in the lead up to the Egyptian bondage. And what that means is we're going to be talking predominantly about the transition from what we saw in our last lesson into the point in time where the Jews are actually in Egypt, or the prototype or proto-Israelites. So let's go to Genesis 34. We're going to start in Genesis 34 here. Genesis 34:1 says, "Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her and violated her. His soul was strongly attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the young woman and spoke kindly to the young woman. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, 'Give to me this young woman as a wife.' And Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah, his daughter. Now his sons were with his livestock in the field, and so Jacob held his peace until they came. Then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. And the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard of it, and the men were grieved and very angry, because he had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter. It's a thing which ought not to be done." Now, when we read this story, we read it and it's very easy to conclude that Shechem violated Dinah in the sense that he forced himself on her, that he raped her. But I actually don't think that that's what happened. The word violated in Greek means to, like we're looking at the Septuagint, for example, it means to bring low or to humble or to humiliate, I guess would depend on the context. And the word in verse 5 that is defiled, when Jacob found that his daughter had been defiled, it means to be made ritually or religiously impure, which doesn't automatically imply rape, but it simply implies being intimate without being married, if you look again at the context. Verse 3 tells us that Shechem loved Dinah and he spoke kindly to her. Then he begs his father, who was the local ruler, he's actually called the king, and Shechem is called the prince. But he begs his father to strike a deal with Jacob so that he could marry her. And it sounds like to me, as I read this, that he, or meaning Shechem, or the both of them, including Dinah, were maybe overcome with passion and were intimate with each other, and in doing so rendered Dinah impure. And I think that is the sense of the humiliation or the violation that's being talked about here. And one of the implications of having that perspective on what happened in the story is that there was already a law about this, that young women of marriable age were to retain their sexual purity until they got married. That wasn't unique to the law Obviously, that was the expectation prior to the law. We're again several hundred years, over 400 years away from that. Now, if you continue to read the story, which you're not going to go through, I'm not going to read through all the details. What we see is Dinah's brothers, right? All of the existing sons of Jacob at this point are outraged, and they deceive Shechem and his father Hamor, who was the king or the ruler of that area. And they tell them that as long as the people in that land all become circumcised like the Israelites were, then the sons of Jacob were willing to let their daughters intermarry with the local people. And in fact, in one of the verses it says, we shall be one people, or we shall be one nation. And that really made Shechem happy, because it meant that he got to marry Dinah. And so Shechem's father Hamor, who again is the king in that area, goes to the leaders of the city. It says that he went to the gate of the city, and the gate of the city typically is where the leaders, like a city council, would meet, for example. And he basically pitches it to them like this. He says, something like, hey, if we get circumcised and they give us their daughters, won't that mean that we will all prosper? Which is revealing, because what we've seen with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is that they keep making mistakes and getting richer as a result of that. And with Jacob, he spent a long time being used by Laban, because Laban knew that God's blessing was upon him, and he knew that whoever was associated with Jacob would be blessed by God. And so I think the circumstance is exactly the same here, that Hamor was looking beyond just pleasing his son. He was looking on how to be associated with Jacob and his people in peace, so that he could experience the blessing of God by his association with Jacob. So the city leaders, they all decided to submit to circumcision. And while they were in the midst of recovering from that, two of Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, and these were, Simeon, Levi, Dinah, these were all children of Leah. Leah was the first wife, the one that was unloved by Jacob. But Simeon and Levi came in, and using their swords, they killed all of them, which of course made Jacob heartsick. And he said, what have you done? You've made me obnoxious in the eyes of the people. Let's continue on in Genesis 34, verse 26. And they killed Hamor and Shechem. So they weren't content to kill off the leaders of the city. They went and they killed Hamor and Shechem, his son, with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah from Shechem's house and went out. Now, notice there it doesn't say that they rescued her. There's no implication that she was there against her will. In fact, it seems like she was probably there very willingly, which to me again implies that the crime that they committed was perhaps a crime of passion and not being able to control themselves. Verse 27, the sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city, because their sister had been defiled. They took their sheep, their oxen, their donkeys, what was in the city and what was in the field, and all their wealth, all their little ones and their wives they took captive, and they plundered even all that was in the houses. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have troubled me by making me obnoxious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And since I am few in number, they will gather themselves together against me and kill me. I shall be destroyed, my household and I. But they said, should he treat our sister like a harlot? Now notice there in verse 31 that Moses offers zero commentary here. He doesn't affirm that what Simeon and Levi did was right. He doesn't say that it was wrong. But, when you and I read stories like this, do we really expect the people of the Bible to act righteously and justly in every single circumstance? And I think the answer certainly for our group in our fellowship is that no, we've already seen Abraham making many mistakes, but over time growing in faith and growing in character as God gave him time to learn and to change. And this is another thing I think that people who are critics of the faith and the Bible like to point out is like, oh, the Bible condones this and the Bible condones that. And the response to that should be, no, it doesn't condone it, but this is the history of the people. This is one of the things that I think is a testimony to the truth of the Bible. Is if you were to write a story just to make yourself look good, you're just going to make stuff up, you're probably going to not paint yourself in unkindly terms. You're not going to show yourself making major mistakes, right? You're probably going to talk yourself up. And this is, some of the things that we see with historical records when, great generals or emperors win wars and the history books are written. Of course, the history is written by the victor. That's an old saying. And they tend to paint themselves in a very glorious light, but not so the Bible. The Bible shows, the saying is warts and all. It just, we show all the defects and all the faults. And I think that adds to the trustworthiness of the message that we're reading. So we can't forget that when we're reading these stories and we're seeing the mistakes that people are making, because, quite honestly, it's a little bit harsh to slay the leadership of an entire city because your sister was passionate about a young man and made a mistake. To you and I, that would seem pretty harsh. But again, we can't forget that these stories are about the history of training a people, training in righteousness, which is living in accordance with God's moral code, his laws. We have to expect to see mistakes in these stories. We have to expect to see the imperfection and the immaturity and the rashness and the poor judgment, because that is where God is taking his people from. He's growing them to the point where they don't make those mistakes. And as we see these stories, and read them, what we're seeing is we're looking at the opportunity that God has given his people to learn and grow, and it's a demonstration of his patience and his mercy. Right? It's patience and mercy in action as we read these stories. But for those who don't learn and grow, because there's certainly plenty of examples of those as well, we also get to see God's patience in those circumstances, because God typically gives people who are rebellious and unfaithful enough rope to hang themselves. He gives them opportunity to turn and repent, or to keep going and prove themselves wicked. And in those circumstances, when he has been patient with someone who is consistently making mistakes, when he brings justice, we know that he is justified in his judgment. And this is part of how God has been and is continuing to work. And as we look again at these stories, we see two paths constantly being illustrated by the choices of people choosing to grow with God or not. And we see it, of course, played out in those classic pairings. We saw it played out with Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau. And I think all of these individuals are used as types of the two halves of the future generation. Let me explain what I mean by that. Jacob and Esau, Isaac and Ishmael, the choices and the fate of the faithful and the unfaithful is a mirror to what we eventually see with the entire nation. And of course, that's still being played out, right? Because even in the modern church, and looking forward to what we see in the book of Revelation, we see the same thing, right? We see the parable in Christ's ministry about the goat and the sheep, or about the wheat and the tares, and we see Christ coming back, and even among his own people, judging their first, right? I said earlier that God deals harshly with unfaithfulness and unrighteousness in his own people, but we see this constant division. Like, here's the path, and you can choose, but know the fate or know the outcome of the choice that you're actually making. And I think that through all these stories, we learn that God is really the only one who can perfectly balance mercy and justice. Right? Man does it. We try to do it. We do it imperfectly, but God is the only one who can do it perfectly. Let's move on to Genesis 35. I want you to notice what happens next in this story. Right? What we've seen now is we've seen Dinah making this mistake with Shechem. We've seen the brothers deceiving people and literally murdering a bunch of people in response to this, and then they take all their stuff. They basically plunder the entire city. And then here's what we see. Then God said to Jacob, this is chapter 35:1. God said to Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there, and make an altar there to God who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau your brother." And Jacob said to his household, and notice this, and to all who were with him, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourselves, and change your garments. Then let us arise and go to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and has been with me in the way which I have gone." So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which were in their hands, and the earrings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree which was by Shechem. And they journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were all around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. So there's a couple of things to note here. First of all, that Jacob had absorbed all the people and the possessions of Shechem into his own community, right? After they killed the leaders and ended, if the story is told in a timeline fashion, they ended by killing Shechem himself and Hamor, his father, and then they took all the stuff. It literally says they took everything, including what was in all the houses, all the animals, all the women, all the children. Jacob absorbed these people into his community. Now, in this story, Jacob has 11 sons. Benjamin hasn't been born yet. But these 11 sons had daughters, plural. If you go back and you read the story of the negotiations, the brothers of the sons of Jacob and the brothers were saying, hey, we'll let our daughters, plural, marry with you if you just get circumcised. And, the law of averages, of course, says that they probably had a bunch of sons as well. And that's also not counting the people who are part of their community that were handed down from Isaac and Abraham. So I don't want you to think that even though Jacob said, hey, we are few in number, he was probably making that statement in comparison to a fully populated city, perhaps with one that may have had some kind of a fighting force. When you really think about it, Jacob's community included all of his sons, his sons' daughters, their wives, as well as all of the servants and all of the other people that they would have, and I'm going to use the word inherited, and it just doesn't feel right saying that about inheriting people, but I think when we understand Old Testament servitude, I think that it's okay to talk about that. But these people that they inherited from Isaac, who inherited them from Jacob, who got a lot of these from Egypt, right? And so Jacob's community was way larger than his family, than the ones who were actually physically and directly descended from him. And I'll mention it here now because I don't think we'll get to actually read this part of the story, but a little bit later, when it talks about Jacob and his family moving into Egypt, and this is part of the story of Joseph, it talks about how there were 70 people that went in there. In fact, the Septuagint says there were 75. Scholars look at these two numbers and they say, well, the Septuagint is probably counting the grandsons of Joseph that were actually born in Egypt, so there's really no conflict there. But here's what I want you to know, is that when we start looking at a head count or a census, God always instructed his people, and we're going past the story where we are right now. In fact, you can see this early on in the book of Numbers. When God had his people count their numbers, he had them only count men of military age. And that's why it says that about 600,000 people came out of Egypt. That was just men of fighting age. That didn't include brothers or younger brothers and sisters or wives or anything like that. And so the estimate of the number of people that came out of Egypt was probably somewhere around 2.5 million people. So when the Bible says that 70 people went into Egypt, that's counting only those who were direct physical descendants of Jacob, who were likely men of military age. So, we're talking about 18, 20 and above. And what that means is that way more people actually went into Egypt than that 70 number predicts. And so if we get to a point where we talk about, hey, what was the population and how do you grow from 70 people to 600,000 people and do that in a couple of hundred year period of time? Can that actually happen? Statistically, absolutely it can. God said that when he brought them down into Egypt, he said, I will multiply you. And what that means is that women will have more kids for longer periods of time. You'll have more people being born than are dying. And that's how a population grows very, very quickly. And in fact, I did some statistical modeling on this. And if we just assume that the number 70 was like just the real strict, clear number, you can get from 70 people to 600,000 people in 210 years with a growth rate of somewhere around 4.4%. Which certainly wouldn't be unheard of in that time. In fact, Benjamin himself had 10 kids, right? So if you have 12 men having 10 kids every couple of generations, that multiplies very, very, very quickly. So that was just kind of a little bit of a side because I think it's important to to try to hold some of these things in our mind. Jacob says, we're few in numbers and people are going to conquer us. Well, not necessarily so. We even saw in the story of Abraham when he went to rescue Lot. He conquered multiple armies with 318 men with the favor of God, and that's the key thing. And that's what we don't hear expressed in Jacob's statement. Oh, you've made me obnoxious. We're few in numbers. They're going to come and they're going to wipe us out. In that moment, even Jacob in his older age had moments where he wasn't thinking about the blessings and the favor of God. And maybe it was just because he was so distraught because the thing that his sons had done. Now, so here we see God saying, he says, head back to Bethel. So Jacob tells the new people, he says, all those who are with him, he says, he tells them to prepare themselves. He says, put away your idols, purify yourselves, and change your garments. Now think about those three things. I mean, to me, that sounds an awful lot. Let me say it again. He said to put away your idols, purify yourselves, and change your garments. And again, it sounds an awful lot to me like repent and be baptized and put on Christ, which is the pattern, right? And this is what we're learning as we go through the Bible, is that we have patterns, we have parallels, we have metaphors, and the things that we read about and learn in the New Testament they're not just simple repetition of things that God had done in the past. I think the things that happened in the Old Testament are there as precursors and foreshadows of what had already been planned to be done in the New Testament under the New Covenant. I think there's a big parallel, right? This is a metaphor and a parallel to the New Covenant when Jacob said to these new people, put down your paganism, purify yourselves, and then change your garments. And again, it's a quite picture, but it's also that little encapsulated story. It's also a counter parallel to what we see later with Aaron and the golden calf, where he had, coming out of, when the Jews came out of Egypt, they were given great riches. And so what happened when Moses was up on the mountain and everyone was like, oh, where'd he go? He's not coming back. We may as well make our own God and head back to Egypt. They gave him all their rings, their earrings, and their jewelry, and Aaron melted it down to make the golden calf. And so this is like a counter story, but it's a very, very similar scenario or very, very similar circumstance. Now, the final thing to note here in this part of the story is that as Jacob's community traveled towards Bethel, the cities that they passed were struck with the fear. It says that they had the terror of God. And what I see in this is that the word of God word was getting around and had been for a few generations that God would deal with you in accordance to how you dealt with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The fame of the God of Abraham had spread long before the Jews crossed the Jordan to take the city of Jericho. And that's part of the story of Sagittarius and Joshua conquering the land of Canaan. But I know most of you have read the story and think about what they were told. Like, that when they went into the city of Jericho, the Rahab the harlot said to the Jewish spies, our hearts have melted because we've heard what God did bringing you out of Egypt with the Red Sea, right? So the fame of God had already been spreading, and it probably had been spreading all the way back from the time when Abraham conquered the Mesopotamian kings with a force of just a few hundred people. So now we come to the story of Joseph and how the Israelites came to be in Egypt. And I don't want you to lose context and focus in the big picture here. And let me just say quite plainly so we have it out front and it can hopefully sit in the back of your mind as we continue to go through this. And this is something that we've talked about in our sermons and our lessons before, is we've talked about how there was a purpose to their time of affliction. And the time of affliction being 400 years is longer than the time in Egypt. If you look at the Bible, you do the math, they were in Egypt just a little bit over 200 years, 4 generations specifically. So the time of affliction was beyond that, but there was a specific reason for God to bring the Jews into Egypt, and that was to teach them to cry out for justice, or to get them to the point where they cried out for justice. And you don't know that you need justice until you are treated unjustly. And this is part of the path that God was using to train his people to expect and to embrace the Messiah that was prophesied back in Genesis 3:15. So, looking at the story of Joseph here, eventually Jacob leaves Bethel and he heads towards a city called Ephrath. And the Ephrath was later to be called Bethlehem. So he's heading towards Bethlehem. And in chapter 35, we see two very short stories or short snippets. One is that we have just a few verses that describes Rachel, who was Jacob's great love, dying, giving birth to Benjamin just outside the city of Bethlehem. It said that we were almost there, and she goes into labor and she died. And of course, Benjamin is the final or the 12th of the 12 sons of Israel, and he's the direct brother of Joseph, who's the main character in this story that we're going to be going through. So that's one of those two little tiny snippet stories that we see in chapter 35. We also see a story where Jacob and Esau come together in Hebron to bury their father Isaac after he dies. And there's really no commentary. It just says that, hey, they gathered together in Hebron and they buried Abraham, and that was it. Or I'm sorry, they buried Isaac, and that was it. I mean, literally just a couple of verses. So Genesis 37, Joseph now is 37 years old. Genesis 37:5, and this is the story of the coat of many colors, the dreams, and the interpretation. And I don't want to read the whole thing, but there are a couple of things that I want to look at and some comments that I want to make. So Genesis 37, Joseph is now 17. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. It was stated previously that Joseph was Jacob's favorite, probably because he was the firstborn from Rachel, who was his great love. Now, he wasn't the first son. In fact, he was the 11th son. He had children with Leah. He had 5 or 6 children with Leah, and then he had children with the 2 concubines or the handmaids, and he actually did marry them. So technically, they were his wives as well. But Rachel only gave him 2 children, gave him Joseph and gave him Benjamin. So the older brothers didn't like him very much because he was the favorite. So he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood all around and bound down to my sheaf." And his brothers said to him, "Shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now, if you've read the story, which I know most of you have, we see this actually playing out a little bit later in Egypt when famine forces Jacob's tribe and community to go to Egypt seeking grain and seeking food. The brothers do bow down to him, but they just don't know that it's him. But we'll get there momentarily. Verse 9, then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Look, I've dreamed another dream, and at this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me." The Septuagint says just simply, "and 11 stars bowed down to me." So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?" And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. And, this is, I think, a reflection of the maturity. Jacob had been around. He had made mistakes. He had grown in God. And so he's seeing this young man who is his favorite son, who was not just having these dreams, which it seems that Jacob was starting to think, well, there might be something important going on here. But certainly he understood the dynamic between Joseph and the other brothers. Now, you can read these statements about Joseph and how he's relaying the dreams to his brothers, and you can read into it how he was being braggadocious, or you could read into it that he was just simply unaware of how his brothers were looking at him, and he was just telling him, he was just kind of immature and unaware. And that tends to be my opinion. I don't think it matters really one way or another to the story, whether we see Joseph growing from immaturity and really not having much of a clue to being this tremendous leader, or from being an arrogant young man to being humbled in Egypt to being a great leader. Either way, we see the same growth and we see the same kind of process. So notice that Jacob himself interprets the dream. He says, are your mother and I and your brothers to bow down to you? So obviously he is interpreting this saying, he is the sun, that uh, the mother is the moon. And, I made a note to myself here, Rachel question mark, because Rachel at this point is dead. So when Jacob is saying, "Shall I and your mother, or your mother and I, bow down to you?" He's either thinking that the fulfillment of this is actually after a resurrection. It's one possibility, but it could just very simply be that he's talking about Rachel's handmaid Bilhah, probably would have stepped into a position as Joseph's stepmother. Probably not necessarily Leah. Leah was what you might call the first wife because she was married to uh, Jacob first, and she gave him the most sons, certainly gave him his firstborn male son. But Bilhah was the handmaid of Rachel specifically. And the reason why Jacob had children with Bilhah was because Rachel was barren for a time. And that was God, I think, showing favor more so to Leah because Jacob was so enamored with Rachel and really didn't pay much attention to Leah. But either way, I have a feeling that it refers actually to a stepmother rather than a post-resurrection reference to Rachel being around at the time when everyone bows down. Now, maybe there's one other possibility, which is that phrase, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars, refers to, the entire family as a unit. There is a phrase, and it's escaping me at the moment, but basically, we've seen several places, and we continue to see this throughout the Bible, is that sometimes individuals are named, but it's actually referring to large populations. So, for example, I think last week we talked about in Malachi, God says, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, but he was talking about the faithful and the unfaithful portions of the nation of Israel. He wasn't talking about the individual men themselves. And so it's quite possible that when Jacob says, he's interpreting the dream, he's basically thinking about the entire family unit, and it probably refers to how, as this story plays out, the entire community that is under Jacob's leadership becomes entirely dependent on Joseph in Egypt during a famine that shows up down the road. And I think that's probably the best way to look at it, that this phrase is not specific to Rachel and Jacob and his brothers. It's just saying that the whole community is going to be dependent on Joseph. So either way, what Moses is showing us is how Jacob's favoritism and Joseph's youthful ignorance creates this animosity among his brothers. And, it probably wasn't a secret that Rachel was Jacob's great love, and that Joseph, being her firstborn, probably had favored status because of that. And that, honestly, if you start thinking about the dynamics in the culture, where, for example, this could have created a very specific rift between Joseph as the firstborn of Rachel, but the 11th of 12 sons, eventually 12 sons, and Reuben, who was the true firstborn, born from Leah. He was the one who was first in line for the birthright. And remember, there's a difference between the birthright and the blessing. The birthright had to do with the practice of handing leadership and authority over to the eldest. And typically when there was land and property to be divvied up among male children, the eldest, the one who had the birthright, got a double portion, right? He didn't necessarily own everything, but he got a double portion, yet he retained authority and he retained figurehead status. And that's different than the blessing, which is where the patriarch basically extends the blessing of the Abrahamic covenant to a very specific son. And we saw that with Abraham and Isaac choosing Jacob, and we'll see this a little bit later, probably on a different lesson where Jacob prophesies over Judah specifically. Now, as the story goes on, the brothers conspire to kill Joseph, and it's actually Reuben alone who steps in and says, no, we shouldn't kill him. Let's just drop him in a well, and we'll just leave him there. And we see later that he actually comes back to free Joseph, but Joseph had already been sold into slavery at the suggestion of Judah. And I thought, well, why would Reuben show such compassion? Was it because he was the eldest and he was a little bit more seasoned, a little bit more mature? Or, and listen, we're not told specifically why he did this, but sometimes you can look at things and you can piece things together with some reasonable degree of certainty. One of the things that happened, we didn't read it, but you might want to check this out on your own. Back in Genesis 35, right after Rachel dies, again, we see just 2 or 3 lines in the Bible. That's all. It's just, hey, this happened. What we see is Reuben being intimate with Bilhah. And Bilhah, again, was Rachel's handmaid, but she was one of Jacob's other wives, a woman that he had actually fathered children through. And so Reuben is intimate with Bilhah. And the Septuagint, in the translation, it basically says that when Jacob found out, he considered what Reuben to have done to have been evil. It uses the word evil specifically. And so maybe Reuben was being a protective older brother, the wisest and the kindest of them all, saying, hey, this is our kid brother, let's not kill him. Or maybe he was trying to get back in God's good graces or not God, but his father's good graces by saving his father's favorite son. Like, we don't know because there's no commentary. All we see is that little snippet. Here's what happened. We see another man in the Bible who is theoretically a righteous man making a big mistake and doing something that he shouldn't have done. So, excuse me. So here we have Joseph. He's sitting in the bottom of the well. What ends up happening actually is Judah says, hey, why should we not profit off this? Let's not spill his blood. Let's not just leave him there. Let's sell him to these Midianite traders. And these Midianite traders, this caravan that shows up actually is a bunch of Ishmaelites, which is kind of interesting because it means that they're all cousins, like long lost cousins. So what happens is they sell him to the Midianite traders, and he gets sold to a man named Potiphar in Egypt, who is an official in Pharaoh's kingdom in his household. And then the brothers take the coat of many colors that Jacob had given to Joseph, and they bring it back and say, hey, is this your son's coat? And Jacob, of course, goes into mourning, and he tears his coat and throws ash on his head and puts sackcloth around him. Again, another kind of a side story, but it's another revealing story that these people were not perfect, and God was patient with them. Chapter 38, and we'll get back to Joseph here in a second. Chapter 38 shows Judah going off on his own. And I think it's important for us to see the story for eventually who Judah was or who he became in the genealogy of Christ, right? It was through Judah that the King David came, and eventually the Christ. But we see him going off and actually marrying a Canaanite woman, which was, I don't know if it was strictly forbidden, but certainly when Jacob was instructing his household servant to find a wife for Isaac, he said, don't let him marry a Canaanite. Send him back home and let him marry one of his relatives, but don't let him marry a Canaanite. So here we see Judah going off, and he falls in love with this Canaanite woman, and he actually has 3 sons with her. And then when his oldest son is old enough, he has him marry a girl named Tamar. And again, many of you, I know this story. I know you know this story. But basically, the son, and I didn't record his name, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but basically Tamar's husband was an evil man, and God, takes back his breath of life. He kills him because he's evil and wicked. And so what Judah does is he has the second son then marry Tamar to produce an heir. And the way this worked back then, this is what is called a levirate or levirate marriage, and that is where if a man dies childless and with no heir, then the younger brother or brother is obligated to marry her and produce an heir for the dead brother. So the second son goes in and he isn't intimate with her, and the implication is he does this several times, but each time he's unwilling to actually follow through with the act in the sense of truly actually impregnating her. And more than likely the reason is because had she gotten pregnant and produced a male child, that male child would succeed him as the heir, as the one who would actually receive the birthright. So what ends up happening, because the second son decides that he's not going to impregnate Tamar, God kills him as well. And so finally Judah says, okay, Tamar, just go and live as a widow until my youngest son is old enough to fulfill this duty. And again, this practice of a brother marrying his dead brother's wife in order to produce an heir. It's called a levirate or levirate marriage, and it's not unique to the Jews by any means. So you can look this up on your own. Wide resources. It's not something that's kind of strange or weird. It's was practiced through a lot of the Eastern Asian cultures. It was practiced in several African communities as well. So this is not unique to the Jews. This was something that these ancient cultures did. So what happens then is Tamar is living as a widow, and the youngest boy is growing up. Judah's wife, the Canaanite woman, dies, and basically what ends up happening is Judah refuses to, even when his youngest son is old enough to fulfill this levirate marriage and give Tamar an heir, Judah refuses to allow him to do it. And so after Judah's wife dies, Tamar actually dresses up like a prostitute or a harlot and tricks Judah into being intimate with her, and she becomes pregnant with twins. And these twins are eventually named Perez and Zerah. Basically, when it's found out that Tamar is pregnant, it's brought to Judah's attention. Of course, Judah doesn't know that he's actually the father, and so he says to burn her. And then Tamar, reveals that he is the father of her twins, and he, in a moment of maturity, admits his guilt and spares her life. Right? But again, we see this man who is not fulfilling his promises. He's not fulfilling his obligation as the patriarch of that particular family, and making sure that there was an heir with Tamar for his eldest son. And then he goes and he tarries with a harlot and is willing to have his daughter burned because he thinks that she's played the harlot when actually he was the father. So again, a key figure in these stories doing things that they shouldn't. One more thing about these twins, because we're really not told much about them at all, specifically about Zerah. Zerah, if you read the account, is kind of like a little funny one. What happens is Zerah, the baby as he's being born, sticks his hand out, and the midwife says, hey, he was born first because he came out first, and she wraps a twine or a string around his arm, but then the hand disappears again, and out comes the other baby, Perez. And so the one who was born first actually was born second, if that makes sense to you. But what ends up happening is that Perez becomes the favored son of that line, and Zerah, his lineage and descendancy is really kind of not really even commented on. There are a few obscure things that I found just doing some research, and I honestly don't think we should put much stock into this, but I found a couple of references that talked about Zerah having several children. One, I believe, was called I'm going to mess it up, Darda, I believe, Darda, and there were some theories that he founded a city up in Turkey, close to or on a mountain called Dardania, something like that, and how Zerah actually had some etymological, the fancy word, some etymological connection to the name Zeus, and that this may have been actually where the mythology of Zeus as the god on a mountain all came from. Now, again, I don't think we should put much stock into that, and I haven't done enough research to either confirm it or to refute it. I just thought it was an interesting aside. Nevertheless, of these two different twins, Perez is the one that gets the attention, the second born again. I mean, technically he was second born because Zerah stuck his hand out first. But Perez appears in the genealogy of Christ. And later, as part of the story of the Babylonian captivity, there's a man named Zerubbabel who basically was responsible for rebuilding the temple after Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed it. So when the Jews were allowed to come back under Cyrus, Zerubbabel, who rebuilt the temple, is part of the genealogy of Perez. So he was actually descended from Judah directly. Very interesting. Now, in the meantime, and I'll try to clue this up pretty quickly. I know we're right at 50 minutes here. As time passes, switching back to Joseph now, God's favor rests on Joseph, right? He's been sold into slavery to this man named Potiphar. Again, he's an officer of Pharaoh. And God favors him, and so much so that eventually he becomes a trusted servant of Potiphar. And Potiphar eventually places everything in his possession and in his household under Joseph's control. And he trusted him to the point where he didn't even know what he was doing. All he knew was everything that Joseph did prospered. And it prospered because God's hand was on him with favor and with blessing. And the Bible talks about how God prospered Potiphar because of Joseph, because Joseph was in his household. But the problem is that Potiphar's wife, Joseph, apparently was a pretty good-looking guy, and she kept trying to seduce Joseph, yet he persistently refused out of loyalty to Potiphar and also because it was wrong in the eyes of God. So to get back at him, she claimed that he tried to force himself on her, and Potiphar throws Joseph in the king's jail where, once again, God favors him, and in just a very short period of time, the guards in the prison put him in charge over all the prisoners and all the prisoners' activities. So a little while down the road, the king, the Pharaoh, imprisons his butler and his baker because they offended him. They both have dreams that Joseph is able to interpret. Basically, he predicts that after 3 days, the butler will be released from prison and restored to his former position, while the baker would actually be hanged and would meet his death. And it actually said in the dream, it was, you see the number 3 showing up. And I'm not getting into numerology, and I really don't want to make too much of this, but I have a tendency when I see the phrase like within 3 days or after 3 days, I always wonder if there's a connection to other things that have a 3-day time frame, like Christ rising from the dead in 3 days, Hosea's prophecy, which is really about 3,000 years, but it's Hosea's in chapter 6 is his 3-day prophecy. But in this particular case, we see 2 men in the service of the king. One is judged innocent and he's restored. The other is judged guilty and he's destroyed. And I can't escape this sense that there is a little mini parallel here that continues to illustrate for us in yet another story the fate or the division between the fate of the faithful versus the unfaithful. So the butler is released, and now it goes 2 years down the road. Joseph is in prison still, and he's granted he's in charge of everything and everyone except the guards themselves. But now Pharaoh has a dream. This is his famous dream of the 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And as Pharaoh is trying to get his magicians and his advisors to interpret the dream, nobody can. And so finally the butler goes, I remember this kid Joseph, this Hebrew. And I think it's in this story actually where the word Hebrew is used. It's used twice actually. And I believe it's the first time that they're referred to as Hebrews. But the butler finally remembers Joseph, and he calls him to interpret the dream, which Joseph is able to do, right? And so the Pharaoh relates these dreams where he's standing by a river. He has 2 dreams that basically say the same thing, but he sees the river, and out of the river come these 7 fat cows, then come out 7 sick cows, and the sick cows eat the fat ones. And then in the second dream, we see 7 heads of wheat that are healthy and robust, and then we see 7 weak ones that are diseased and sickly, and they consume the healthy ones. And so basically Joseph says, there's going to be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. So Joseph's recommendation is, hey, Pharaoh, find someone that you trust and harvest and collect as much grain, like take 1/5 of the grain every year. Don't sell it, don't eat it, stick it aside so that it acts as a reserve in the lean years. And so what does Pharaoh do? But he appoints Joseph as second in command over all of Egypt, and he gives the daughter of one of the local priests in his city called On, or in Greek it's Heliopolis. He marries this woman, and he has 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who then go on to have sons in the kingdom of Egypt as well. And so while they were in Egypt, Joseph actually has grandchildren. Now, as predicted, the famine hits the land, and 7 years later, all the food runs out, including all the way up to Canaan. And Canaan was probably, I'm going to estimate, maybe a week's worth of traveling on foot. Obviously a little faster if you're going by horse or some other kind of conveyance. What we see a little bit later, and again, I'm not going to read the specific verses, but we see this progression as the 7 years of famine hit. First, people come and they buy food, but then the money runs out. So instead of giving money, they give all of their animals and all of their flock, all of their sheep, all of their goats, all of their horses in exchange for grain. When that runs out, the people of the land basically say, we have nothing left but ourselves and our property. And so they basically sell themselves into servitude and they transfer ownership of the land to Pharaoh. And what this means is that the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine and God's counsel through Joseph allowed Pharaoh to consolidate great wealth and great power, because back in that time, we think of Pharaoh in the sense of Ramses, being the all-powerful king over all the land of Egypt. Well, it didn't start out that way. There were different regions that have different rulers. Now, they may have all been friendly with each other and associated with each other, but as a result of God's counsel through Joseph, it allowed the Egyptian dynasty, as we understand it, to come about. And don't forget who the Egyptians are, who they were. They were the descendants of Mizraim, the son of Canaan, the son of Ham, the son of Noah. And just like I said earlier about the Ishmaelites being the long-lost cousins of the 12 tribes of Israel, the same thing with these Egyptians. And so we have Joseph basically in charge of the kingdom that is populated by his long-lost cousins, far distant, I'm sure, because we're going, several generations down, but they all came from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Everyone had that same common ancestry. So famine hits Canaan. Jacob hears about food in Egypt. He sends his 10 sons. He keeps Benjamin at home because he's afraid to lose his youngest again. Then the other brothers go to Joseph to buy food, but of course they don't recognize him. And it's in this instance that we see the fulfillment. It happens several times, but they come in, and I would imagine, it's not described this way, but I would imagine that Joseph is dressed like an Egyptian. He's probably, you've seen the movies, he's probably wearing the makeup, the guy liner, and all that kind of stuff. They don't know who he is. They just know that he's the governor. He's the one who's in charge. And if they want food, it's got to come from him. And so they come in and they bow down to him. Just exactly like his dream had said when he was 17 years old. And now, if I remember correctly, he's about 40 years old at this point. So we're talking like a couple of decades down the road. They haven't seen him. They think he's dead. They don't recognize him because of his getup. So now read Genesis 45, because what we're going to do is we're going to skip a couple of things. We just kind of outline it here. What ends up happening is they come and they buy food, but Joseph is moved with compassion, and so he has his servants put the money that they spent to buy the food back in their sacks, so that when they get home, they open their sacks out and they realize, oops, we got grain and we still have our money. There must be some kind of mistake. And they're actually afraid to go back because they're afraid that this governor who treated them harshly while they were there, they're afraid that they're going to think that they stole their money. So then they come back again. Jacob sends them back. Let's just pick up here in Genesis 45, because what ends up happening is that Joseph eventually reveals himself. He goes through a little bit of shenanigans where he says, oh, you got a younger brother? Why don't you go back and send someone back? I'll keep this dude here called Simeon, and I'll throw him in jail just to make sure that you come back, and go and get your father and get your younger brother and bring him back so I can verify that what you said is true. So they basically do everything that he said, and they come back with Benjamin. And now Joseph is revealing who he is, revealing his identity. Genesis 45:5. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Right? And we start thinking about, well, why on earth would God put the people of Israel through the Egyptian bondage? Why did he move them there? Well, the first thing he did was he moved them there to protect them. because this famine was coming. Now, you could argue whether the famine was just a natural phenomena and God was just maneuvering his people, or maybe God caused the famine. I mean, ultimately, it doesn't matter because these people ended up in Egypt, and here we're being told why. So God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years, the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you on the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Skip down now to Genesis 46:1. There's this great reunion, there's forgiveness, there's tears. And then Joseph sends his brothers back with Pharaoh's blessing, with food and animals and carts, and says, get your people, get your dad, and come back and live in the best of the land that we have to offer, this place called Goshen. And so the brothers go back and tell Jacob that Joseph is still alive, and Jacob can't believe it, but he eventually does, and he agrees, and he says, let's go see my boy. Genesis 46:1. So Israel, this is Jacob, took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. He's on his way now to Egypt. Then God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. So he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. And so here we see God continuing to fulfill his promises. This is where he says, I will make you a great nation. Now notice he says it specifically to Jacob. And this is where, of course, and we've talked about this in many lessons, and this is something that Paul points out in Galatians, that one of the mistakes that the Jewish people made and make is that they think that just simply because they are of Abraham's seed, they are descended from him, that they automatically inherit the promises based on genetics or genealogy. But the promises were made to specific people. They were made to Abraham as a man. They were made to Isaac as an individual man. And here he was saying that God is talking to Jacob and saying, I will make you a great nation. It's going to be done, again, I use the phrase the crucible or the cauldron of Egypt. So these are promises to individual people. And we'll see a little bit down the road that the next individual person that promises are reiterated to is the King David. So these are not collective promises. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. People other than Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, and the Christ can participate in the promises conditionally, right? But God swore an oath that he would unconditionally fulfill these promises to these specific men. It's important to remember that. But I love this. He says, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. And again, just to reiterate, you can use a population calculator and you can plug in some simple numbers, like starting with 70 people going 210 years with a growth rate of 4.4 gets you at about 600, a little over actually, about 667, I think, 667,000 people. But I do believe that more than 70 went into Egypt. And even though the Bible says 600,000 came out, that's just men of fighting age. And there were several million people that came out under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. So we're going to leave it there for today. That's really just our introduction to the story of Libra. We have 2 more weekends to talk about the actual story of the giving of the law. And one of the things we'll make sure that we mention is that during this story, we actually see 2 of the feast days happening, and that would be the Feast of Passover and the Feast of Pentecost, which is, at least in the Old Testament era, the celebration of the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. So over the next 2 weeks, we'll keep going through these stories, and we'll bring us all the way up to the story of Kadesh Barnea. All right, God bless. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll talk to you soon.